article was in I was working on was like, is fitness only for thin white women? The only people reading anything I wrote were my friends and family. I think I had like 300 Instagram followers. But I was like so worried about writing this article because it was so controversial. So I wrote the article and then I never posted it. And I remember like a few months passed and my mentor was like, hey, whatever happened with that article? And I was like, oh, actually, I never posted it. She was like, why? I'm like, because I'm actually just like really scared. I don't know what people are going to say. And she essentially was like, listen, you can stay scared and never write anything, or you can write the things that you're really passionate about and just see what happens. And she's like, also, you can never be a change maker in the industry if you're like afraid to be seen. And I was like, well, okay, whatever. um, but this was when I was still working my corporate job. So there was a day I had to travel for work. So I was like, I'm going to post this article while I will be away from the internet and like just like post and run essentially. So I did that. I posted and ran. And the weirdest thing happened when I came back to internet, the blog was getting shared like all across social. The people that strangers were reading it and sharing it.
You are listening to My Rejection Story, hosted by Alice Draper. Chrissy King, welcome to My Rejection Story.
Oh, hi. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Me too. Before we dive into our conversation, do you mind introducing yourself to the audience, who you are, what you do, whatever you think is relevant to include?
Sure. My name is Chrissy King. I'm a writer, speaker, author. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York. I do a lot of my work in the writing space around body liberation, also the importance of creating an inclusive wellness industry. I'm a formal personal trainer, so I have deep roots in the wellness and fitness space, and I do a lot of educational work around inclusion in different industries as well.
I really enjoyed what I have read so far, which was your book and a couple of Substack posts. And I think it was your most recent Substack post, you spoke about this zealous return of white supremacist culture that we're currently experiencing. And I'm curious to hear from you what your thoughts are on what's happening in the world right now. Especially, I know you've done a lot of work in the DEI space, and a couple of my clients also are in that space, and we've seen that people don't want to talk about it anymore, and they're starting to have to shift their messaging to retain contracts and clients. So yeah, how are you doing with what's happening in the world?
I think it's really interesting. I think for one thing, I will say that I even spoke to this a little bit in my book, that even as early as 2022, I saw the tides kind of shifting away from it. And so I don't think it's entirely surprising, but also it still is disappointing. And I think for me in particular, my work really exploded in 2020 because people were really, these are concepts and things I've been talking about for years and years and years. And then I think in 2020, people were like, oh my gosh, this is important. And so we saw this huge like uptick in people really wanting to be interested in having these conversations and buying books and listening and learning. And I think the unfortunate thing is I think a lot of people approached the work of anti-racism, and the dismantling of white supremacy almost like a self-improvement project, right? And so it's like, oh, I feel good about myself. I'm on the right side of history. When actually, when we talk about what it really takes to dismantle white supremacy culture and anti-racism, it really takes a sacrifice, right? It takes the work. It takes making uncomfortable decisions. It takes being uncomfortable a lot of times on an ongoing basis, not just for a short period of time. And so I think people got tired and worn out, and I think the recognizing like what it really means and what it takes was overwhelming for people. And also I think that when we're talking about white supremacy and dismantling of those things and this idea of privilege, I think that like when you really step back and look at it, people oftentimes like the benefits that privilege bring them. And so it's also like you have to be willing to part ways with those things. And so I think it just became less popular. And again, I think when I look at historically speaking, like myself and other educators during that time period, we weren't really saying anything different than what like civil rights activists were saying, for example, right? And we have like regurgitating information has been in the world for a long time. So it's not like a lack of information. It's a lack of people's desire to really have long-term sustainable change and equity. And so it's not super surprising, but it is still disappointing. And I think sometimes feels exhausting. Sometimes feels like, what's the point of keep talking about these things when it sometimes feels like people don't want actual lasting change. The work is always important, though. I think it is also important. I think the last 4 years have taught me, though, to pivot in a way that I do the work in a way that feels sustainable, and that also sustainable, like just personally and emotionally, but also financially, and also in a way that is filled with joy still, because joy is a big part of liberation, right? And so it can't just be always feelings of like struggle and overwhelm and frustration. There also has to be moments of joy as well, and prioritizing that in our lives.
Yeah, there's so many thoughts that came up as you were talking, but I think something that I just want to sort of chat about is I think what's interesting about, I guess, racial topics, DEI work, is that it's different to a lot of other social justice movements in the sense that I think people like you who were talking about it for so long felt like you were talking into the void, no one was listening, and then suddenly it was like the trendy thing. And I don't think that that's happened with a lot of like social movements. So, I mean, I thought at the time that like, wow, okay, the world is moving into a really good place. Like people want to talk about this sort of stuff. I'm from South Africa, and so the topics were being discussed widely in South Africa as well, because even though the demographics are different, like there's a black majority and white minority, the power dynamics are the same, where it's, you know, white South Africans hold the power in terms of land, jobs, resources. So the topic was really relevant. And so it was also those conversations were filtering down. So it's a weird one because there would, of course, be hope and optimism amongst people who care about these things in that period. And then to realize that it was all just, you know, so that people could feel good about themselves or their organizations in the moment. So yeah, I don't know if... I guess the question I want to ask you is that feeling you touched on how it's hard to sort of stay motivated, and you're trying to figure out a way where you can embrace this work more sustainably. I'm curious kind of how you're going about that given the shifting tides, I guess.
Yeah, I think that one thing I don't have all the answers yet, by the way, but one thing I am really intentionally thinking about a lot lately as it pertains to liberation in particular is that, I think that I spent a lot of time over the last 4 years trying to help people understand the realities of white supremacy, in particular how it harms all of us, right? Like, I think that when we think about racism and white supremacy, oftentimes we're thinking, of course, we are always centering the most marginalized among us. But it's also important to recognize that white supremacy hurts all of us, regardless, even white folks, right? And so I think I spent a lot of time trying to connect those dots for people and trying to help people understand and trying to convince people the realities of that. And I think as I move forward, one of the things that I'm really focusing on is spending less time trying to convince people and speaking more to people who already understand and are looking towards how do we create spaces that feel more liberatory for all of us, and speaking to folks who are like, I want to be on that journey. I understand and I'm on that journey, versus me trying to explain, convince, give people the resources to learn about these topics, because I think what I've learned is like the resources have always been there, right? It's just the people's desire to really spend the energy and the attention and the time investing in those things. And so I think that's what's more important for me, is speaking to people who are on this journey. And again, how can I serve those folks versus trying to convince the greater population that these things are still important. And even now, especially trying to convince people that we still need to be talking about these things, even though they're not trendy anymore. And I think we're seeing, globally, like especially in the States, with like Target rolling back DEI issues and all these companies rolling back DEI issues, I feel like those are almost permission slips for individuals to be like, oh, see, those things don't matter anymore. And so I think there's less concern for me to try to convince people that things matter, and more concern of like, how can I speak to people and encourage people and support people who are, number one, feeling the effects of these things, and then secondly, who already understand or like, I want to be a part of the change, not to convince people that these things matter.
I love that. I can see if you went with the former and not the latter, that one could easily get burnt out fairly quickly. Yes. And lose kind of any momentum towards the movement. Something else that you wrote about in your Substack is how thinness is back with vengeance. Yeah. So I'm curious in the topic of rejection, like it's hard to, I guess, feel like you've done all this work and you've seen society move in what seemed like a good direction, even if it had its flaws and its problems.
Mm-hmm.
And then the pendulum swings and it goes back. And of course, you know, as someone who's been a creator and a thought leader in this space, how has that been observing this?
Yeah, it's hard. It's so hard. If I'm being completely honest, it's been challenging because I think that I was so optimistic over periods in the last couple of years. I remember my book came out in March of 2023. Yes, March of 2023. And I remember in like 2022, before the book had been published, I was like, oh my gosh, this is probably not even going to be needed because like this is like such, I felt like I was writing something that the world had already understood now. And I'm like, this is wild. By the time it comes out, people are gonna be like, yeah, duh, we already know this. I still knew that the book was going to have impact though, but then the book published and now it's been almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years in March, which is next month already. And now I'm like, oh man, everybody in the world needs to read this book because we just saw such a huge pendulum shift. Like, and I think it goes back, you know, when I think about body liberation topics in particular, I think that we really saw an increase in these topics during 2020 into 2021. And I think especially during this time, COVID was happening, right? Gyms were closed, people were in their houses, people weren't moving. So it's like we are at this place where we're like, people's bodies were changing. And so I think it felt really good collectively for folks to be like, yes, we should embrace our changing bodies. And again, inclusivity was really popular and trendy at that time. So companies were embracing it. We were seeing like plus size diversity and branding. And so I think for one, I talk about in the book, the fact that like, body politics and white supremacy go hand in hand. So I think we were in this collective space where we were all thinking about things differently. And then as we came out of COVID, people got back to the gym. And I think as like this trend of inclusivity kind of started to fade, there was this real pervasive upswing in diet culture. And, you know, one thing I'm really thinking through and writing about and talking about is the fact that anytime we see progress in any realm, right? Whether we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about body positivity, we always see a swift pendulum switch back because, again, especially when we talk about bodies, the diet culture or diet industry is a $70+ billion industry, right? And so what happens if we all suddenly are like, we are happy with the way we exist in our bodies, we want to embrace our bodies in all different shapes and sizes, well, then the diet industry loses money, right? Like the diet industry only thrives because people are unhappy with the way they look. And so I think that there's always going to be a harsh like increase of marketing and media around thinness when we start to see people be excited or embrace the bodies that they're in. And I also very, very much believe that when we are focused on thinness, we have less energy to focus on things that are happening politically. We have less energy to focus on the patriarchy. We have less energy to focus on the fact that our rights are being stripped away. And so it serves everyone for thinness to be trending again, because again, when we are focused on shrinking our bodies, our energy is going towards how much are we working out, how much do we weigh, what are we eating, counting our macros, tracking our calories, watching content from every creator in the world telling us how to get in better shape. Like we don't have the capacity to worry about the things that are far more important. And so I think it's all intentional and very much by design. And I think it all goes hand in hand. And if we look back at different times in history, we can also see this.
Yeah. I'm thinking very much that the, capitalist industry wants to keep us as distracted and also never being able to really attain that that perfect body. And I think that, like you've spoken about this in the sense that as a creator, talk as someone who talks very much on the topics around body liberation and your book, The Body Liberation Project, that you still have days where you struggle with your body image. And I know, like, as someone who talks about rejection, I still get affected by rejection. And so I often feel like a fraud when that happens. And so, I'd love to hear a little bit about that like what we should be striving for, because I think you put it so eloquently, which is that it's not a destination, it's a journey, I guess. So what does it mean to be liberated?
It's a lifelong journey. And so I think when I talk about body liberation and my relationship with my body, and how it's constantly evolving, one thing I always say, that the goal of body liberation is not that like one day you're going to look in the mirror and be like, oh my God, I love everything I see. It's just so perfect. Like, that's not realistic. And I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but that probably won't ever happen. But it is also understanding that your body is worthy and deserving of respect in every iteration. It's also really understanding that your body will have so many different iterations throughout its lifetime. And, you know, when we are saturated with marketing around anti-wrinkles and, you know, being thin and getting a bigger butt, like all of these things that we're supposed to achieve, I think people start to think like, once I get this thing, then I'll feel good. And it's like, I'm telling people all the time from personal experience that I've had I've had multiple quote unquote body transformations, and it was never enough. There was always one more thing I had to do, or 5 more pounds I needed to lose, or then I need to change this part of my body. And like you said, it's a rat race. Like, it's a never ending cycle of trying to be a better and different version. And it's increased by the fact that like body trends are changing, right? Like 10 years ago, BBL was the thing, like the Brazilian butt lift, that was the way to exist, to have the perfect body. Now we're seeing celebrities reverse the BBLs. Now the thin petite frame is back in. So it's like, it's designed to keep you always chasing a different version of yourself. And so when I say that, like, I still have bad body image days, it's because it's true. Like, that's just the reality of it. But the more you work towards body liberation, the more you start to understand, like, these systems are in place to make us feel this way about ourselves, the quicker you can shift those thoughts, right? Like, so those thoughts don't sink me into a depression or send me back to dieting or send me back to excessive exercising. I can recognize, okay, I'm having a bad body image day. Like, these aren't my thoughts, right? And I think, existing in the world right now is really difficult. Like, I live here in New York City. I go to the train station. There's ads for Ozempic in the subway. Like, I'm walking down the street. I'm seeing, like, all types of advertising and marketing around dieting, social media. Go on TikTok. You're just scrolling through TikTok. You're going to see so much content around dieting, around getting thinner, around changing your body, around getting hot for summer. Like, it's nonstop. And so it is really normal to be like, for that messaging to affect you. And if anybody tells you it never affects them, they're not being honest with you, because it does. And so I think the best thing that I do for myself, and I encourage other people to do, is, number one, take a break from social media. Stop spending so much time scrolling, because it really is having an impact on our mental health. It's having an impact on our self-image and our body image. That's one thing. I always say, like, go back to the things that you know to be true. Go back to books that you've read before that have helped you. Go back to those resources. Read them again and again and again. Talk to people that you trust about how are you feeling, because, it's a normal human experience. It's part of our shared humanity. And so I think that's really important. I'm really intentional around my friendships, the people I spend time with, that, like, I don't do diet culture talk around me, right? Like, I just am not going to engage in that. And so I think that setting those boundaries are also really important. And then also just being the number one thing I always say is treating yourself with kindness and compassion, regardless of what you're feeling. If you wake up feeling the best about yourself, if you wake up feeling the worst about yourself, like, treating ourselves with compassion, kindness, grace is so important. And I always say that the relationship we have with ourselves is the most important relationship we could ever have, because we're the only person that we spend every moment of every day with. And so, like, learning to speak kindly to yourself and to show yourself grace and to ask yourself, what do I need when I'm feeling really bad right now?
You covered so many important topics. So I'm hearing no social media, reread the literature, because I think we can read the stuff and it goes through, it's like, wow, and then a bad day hits and you forget all of it and just focus on what's on social media. And talking to people you trust, which I love that, because I talk about community a lot and treating ourselves with kindness, compassion, and setting boundaries. So something that came up, like, as you were talking, is that, we, I don't know, something that I thought about is that and you write about this, is that we inherently want more privilege. I know I want more privilege, so I would think that, okay, I accept my body, I don't have a flat stomach, I'll never have abs, and then I put on a bit of weight, and then it's like, okay, wait, I accepted that body, and I didn't accept this body. And I think that a lot of women can relate to this with our ever-changing bodies. A good friend of mine, she did a lot of work on body acceptance, and she was in a bigger body, and then she got really depressed, and she just lost a lot of weight. And that was the weight loss was a byproduct of other stuff going on in her life. But she said that suddenly, when she noticed how society treated her in a smaller body, there is now this access to privilege that she didn't have before. And she was like, she didn't know how to lose that privilege. And so her body changed again. And it was like, there's a new grief, it was different to the old one, because it's like, now, okay, wait, you've accessed a whole different part of society that you didn't know, that you could be treated that way, and people would engage in you in that way. So yeah, I'm curious to talk a little bit about the the very real external factors that come in when we have a smaller body. We are granted more privilege in the world, essentially.
Absolutely. I talk about that in a lot of the book, because there is a social capital that comes along with being in a smaller body. I would never deny that. I'm really always very honest about that. It's a very real thing. Then privilege exists. The world treats you differently when you're in a thinner body. It's easier to shop for clothes when you're in a thinner body. It's easier to just exist in the world, period, in a thinner body, right? The world is literally catered to thinness. And so it is very real that people treat you differently when you are in a thinner body. It's like you see the difference when you start to gain weight, the way that people treat you. It's very real. I've been in a much thinner body than I am now. I know the differences. And I've never, ever sought to deny that. And so one of the things I talk about in the book, that, again, this piece about compassion is I understand, even though I know that weight loss, being thinner, is not the actual solution. The actual solution is dismantling the systems that allow this to exist. But I always say that I 100% understand why folks are drawn to weight loss, especially when you have several other marginalized identities, right? If you're Black, trans, queer, you're already facing so much discrimination in the world, and maybe thinness feels like the one access to privilege that you have. And so I 100% understand that and hold that with so much compassion. And I never have tried to stray away from that fact, because it would just be disingenuine, because it's a very real phenomenon. But what I also have to remind myself when I'm starting to fall into those traps is that I also have to remember what I had to do to maintain that body, right? I was the most miserable I've ever been. I could not enjoy food out guilt. I didn't want to go out to social events because I was worried about not being able to control every aspect of what I ate. I was spending hours in the gym. I was putting my body through so much trauma in order to maintain this body that I was never designed to have. And I think that's another important part of the conversation, is so much of body politics or body makeup is genetics. Right? And so it's we are following these people on social media, if you just eat this and just exercise, you'll look like me. And it's no, you look like you because genetics are a big part of that. And so we also have to realize that everybody wasn't designed to be thin, and everyone is not genetically predisposed to be thin. And I think it's interesting because we can think about that in terms of hair color and eye color and skin color. We're oh, everybody's genetics are different. That's why we look different. Some people are tall, some people are short. But then when it comes to bodies, we're oh no, we're all supposed to be thin, and we all should be striving for that. And that's just not the reality of it. And so I always remind myself to be in the thinnest version of myself that I was. I was miserable. I had the worst relationship with body image. I had the worst relationship with food. I had the worst relationship with exercise. And even though the world did treat me better, I was the worst version of myself personally, emotionally, mentally, even physically, because my body was I was putting it through a lot of trauma to get it to stay the way that I wanted it to be. And so I think I just have to hold all those truths and recognize that when I am on my deathbed at the end of my life, the people that are closest to me are not going to be remember that summer in, 2000 when Chrissy had that 6-pack abs and her body was just looking so good. That's not what people are going to remember. They're going to remember the memories we shared, the relationships we had, the laughs we shared. Those are the things that are actually important. And the more we can start to recognize that one, life is really short, and do we want to spend all of our energy on the obsession with thinness, or do we want to live life till its fullest because we really don't know how much time we have here. And when I think about those things, that's what draws me back to this idea of liberation and what that really means for myself.
I love that. And it makes me think of a quote you have often in the book, which is that my body is the least interesting part of me, the least interesting thing about me. And it really ties to what you said earlier of keeping us trapped in that diet culture, is keeping us in that loop of distraction. Something that I want to ask you about is as we age, our metabolism slows down, especially as women, and so our bodies will change. And not everyone has that experience where they're were the least happiest version of themselves when they're smaller. Some people were just smaller because they were younger and their metabolism was faster and they hadn't had children or whatever the reasons are. And so I've seen it with some of my friends is that can be like a big grief process when the body changes and it's not what it was when they were 17, 18, not because they were unhappy and dieting back then, but just because their circumstances have changed. Do you have any advice on people who kind of can deal with that shifting body when they may not reflect on their thinness as a negative thing? Perhaps some of the books you've read or any of the ways that you would advise dealing with that?
Yeah, I think, what I speak to in the book is this idea of body grief, and I'm definitely talking about it through the lens of like you having a smaller body or having larger body and having lost weight and then, changing. But to what you're speaking to is like people who have just like probably always been naturally thin and then, life events happen that lead them to being in a larger body. And I think that regardless of the reason, like experiencing grief with a changing body is a very normal experience. And I think it's, beyond just the changing size of your body. We could be, chronically ill and that can change our body. You could be involved in an accident, become disabled and that can change our bodies. I think that the idea that we have ultimate control of our bodies is one of the myths of like healthism, right? That like if we just do all the right things, our body will always show up the way we want it to. And that's just not true. Our bodies will have a different ability statuses over the years. We will have a different ability to do physical things with our bodies as time changes. It could be due to age. It could be due to a multitude of things. And so I think that experiencing grief with our body is something that will happen for most of us throughout the course of our lifetimes for one reason or another. And even just like when you're younger, if you're an athlete and you have an injury and you can't perform the same, or you're out from your, athletic activities for a year or whatever, like there's grief that comes with all of those things. And so I think that we just have to really accept that, ultimately our body, like this physical body, is like just the vessel that is allowing us to have this human experience. And this vessel is going to change, right? Like we can do everything we think we're doing perfectly. And one thing that's guaranteed is this vessel will deteriorate with time and with age, and it will change shapes, it will change sizes, it will change, the skin will sag. Like, and I always say, like, if you're not aging, that means you're dead, right? And so like aging is a natural process, and that means that we're still here experiencing life another day. And so I think that, and again, in a world that tells us we're supposed to look this perfect way for the rest of our lives, we just have to really start decolonizing our minds about our bodies, because our bodies will change. That is a part of the human experience and we can't avoid it. And it's okay to grieve those previous versions of ourselves, and it's normal to grieve those previous versions of ourselves.
I think it's really important, your last point there, it's okay to grieve those previous versions of ourselves, because I think that people who perhaps well-versed in the body positivity space we can gaslight ourselves and be like, well, why do I feel this? I'm just a product of the system, and it's human to react to the systems we're in, and I think that sometimes we forget that. Something that I'm curious about is rejection. Chrissy, we're kind of segueing here, have you experienced a rejection in your life that perhaps changed how you view yourself or view the world?
Yeah, I've had lots of rejections in my life. And I think one of my first like true rejections that I recall as an adult was when I was still working in a corporate job, and I had applied for this what would be a promotion. And I knew, and I'm not saying this to be like braggadocious, but I'm like, I know I'm qualified for this job, right? Like I was so dedicated to my job. I was like, I went above and beyond. I knew I was prepared for this. And so they were hiring like 10 people for this new position. So I was like, oh, of course, I'm a shoo-in for this. There's like no chance. And so I was also like, I worked for the federal government at the time. So they had like all these weird things about like application process. So I went to HR because I wanted to cross my T's, dot my I's, make sure I'd done everything right, you know, because I wanted to get an interview. And then when the announcement for interviews came out, I was not on the list. And I was, when I tell you I was devastated, I was devastated. I had to like leave my cubicle at my office because I was like crying. I was so devastated. I was like, I don't understand how this could happen. I know I'm more qualified than some of these people. Like, I felt so terrible, right? And it took me like weeks to recover, to like just to feel okay, because I was just so devastated. And then maybe like 3 months after that, they had a posting for a different position, which was actually the position I originally wanted, but I felt like they were never going to be hiring for that anytime soon. So I'm like, well, I'm not going to be able to get that job, so I'll go for this job. But the position that I really wanted became available, and they were only hiring 4 people. So I went through the whole process again, and not only did I interview, I got the job. And so I look at that situation, I'm always like, you know, sometimes rejection is just redirection. Because if I had gotten that first position, I would have kicked myself to realize that the job I really wanted was going to be available a couple months later. And so I was like, I was so devastated, but then like literally 90 days later, I was like, wow, thank goodness I got rejected from that position. And so I think that's one of the things I always go back to when I'm feeling, because I've had more rejection since then, but I always go back to that one because number one, it was like when I was young in my career and I was just like so, you know, excited about the world, and I was just like so devastated by this loss or this rejection. But I was like, oh, something better was coming for me. And so that's the thing that I always go back to. That's the story I always go back to when I'm facing rejection now, that this is just a redirection, and something much better is going to develop.
I love that so much. And I mean, I think, you know, when we zoom out and we have that perspective over time, you can see, like you can see from the perspective you have now that that was a redirection. But at the moment, you know, as you said, you were so devastated at the beginning. I think if anyone came up to you and said, you know, it's a redirection, it could be really infuriating. But yeah, it makes me think, you know, how something that I've noticed in a lot of conversations is that when we think that something's a guaranteed yes, the rejection hurts so much more.
Absolutely.
If you had thought that there's no chance you would have gotten this job, it could be disappointing, but kind of like you never expected that expectation in there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about like your kind of more recent life? What is your relationship with rejection like now? Does it still bother you?
Yeah, it's still that view. I think that, especially as a person who's doing more creative things now, writing and like speaking and content, I have had to develop I think a thicker skin for rejection, because that literally is part of it. Like there is just no way to, I think, live in a creative space without understanding that rejection absolutely 100% is going to happen. And so I think over the years, it has become easier for me to accept rejection because I'm like, oh, well, like, yes, that didn't work out. And yes, it's disappointing. And maybe even I thought that it was going to work out. But also, I just like, as a writer, you just have to accept that that's just part of it, right? Like everyone's not going to like the work that you create. Everyone's not going to want you to talk about this thing, or every idea that you pitch is not going to be accepted. And so it's like I had to learn that more, even so, as a creative, because I feel like you have in some ways less control, it feels like sometimes, over how people are going to receive your work or be excited about your work. And so I think for me now, the one thing that I always remember is like my work will land with the people it's supposed to land with. and there will always be criticism. I don't even look at book reviews because I'm like, I don't, that's not for me. That information is for somebody else. That's not my business. Because I did do that one day, and there were like the huge praises, and there were people who are like, this is the worst thing I've ever read. And both those things can be true for people, right? And so it's like that, but those reviews, Goodreads, Amazon reviews, that is not my business. That is for other people. And so I think that I have learned to handle rejection, to handle people's critique in a way that does not affect how I feel. Because if I were to take everyone's rejection or critique personally, I would not create anything else in the world. Like I wouldn't do it. And I always like to think about who, you know what I do sometimes though? This is going to sound cynical, but I do, to make myself feel better if I'm having like a really hard day or if I'm feeling extra rejected, I go to Goodreads and I review like an author who's like my favorite author, or like one of their favorite books that they've ever written that I think is a masterpiece. And you will see that some people think that is that is the worst thing that, you know, anyone has ever read. And I'm like, oh, see, even my favorite author has people who think their work is garbage, and they're doing just fine. Just, you know, help me put things in perspective.
Can I tell you that you are not the first person that has said this on this podcast?
Oh, good.
I've had quite a few authors tell me that they do this.
Yeah,
so I think it's
helpful.
I think it's a really smart strategy. You know, if you are reaching a bigger audience, not everyone is going to like your work. Like if. Did you know that my company, Hustling Writers, books entrepreneurs and authors on podcasts? We've been doing this for the last 5 years, and we've booked our clients on hundreds of top 1% and top 0.5% podcasts, which has, as a result, led to their books being instant bestsellers and even selling out on Amazon on the day of release. If this is of interest to you and the idea of being interviewed by a name like Adam Grant or Mariana Hewitt sounds really exciting, let me know. Email media@hustlingwriters.com and I'll be in touch to book a discovery call. Everyone likes your work. It's because you have a small audience and it's like your mom and your cousins and your friends reading your work. But if more and more people, strangers, are going to read, it's just not going to land with everyone. And that's something I'm curious to know a little bit about, because I think that a lot of people self-reject or don't really do the work to get themselves really out there because they're afraid of that scrutiny and having all the negative parts of being visible, because being visible will come with some negativity. What was that relationship like with you? Do you ever remember if there was like a point where you noticed that, oh wow, like more than just like my close community who really like me are looking at my work now, there's other people that are going to scrutinize and judge me and say not nice things?
Yes, 100%. So again, I have a very pivotal moment that I was like, oh, okay, this is what this feels like. So early on, this was probably like in 2016, maybe 2017. I was very, very much still in the fitness space, like writing fitness related content. And I was also personal training. And I was working with a business coach because I was like doing my thing online. And I wanted to write this article, or I had this idea for an article about this is before I started talking about like anti-racism and inclusion in the wellness space. And it's like the first article. And the article I was working on was like, is fitness only for thin white women? So I was writing this article and I was telling my business coach about it, my mentor, and I was like, I really want this write this article, but I'm also like really scared. Now mind you, again, I was very much the place. The only people reading anything I wrote were my friends and family. I think I had like 300 Instagram followers, 10 people on my subscriber list. Like there was nobody reading it, right? But I was like so worried about writing this article because it was so controversial. So I wrote the article and then I never posted it. And I remember like a few months passed and my mentor was like, hey, whatever happened with that article? And I was like, oh, actually I never posted it. She was like, why? I'm like, because I'm actually just like really scared. I don't know what people are going to say. And she essentially was like, listen, you can stay scared and never write anything, or you can write the things that you're really passionate about and just see what happens. And she's like, also, you can never be a change maker in the industry if you're like afraid to be seen. And I was like, well, okay, whatever. But this was when I was still working my corporate job. So there was a day I had to travel for work. So I was like, I'm going to post this article while I will be away from the internet and like just like post and run essentially. So I did that. I posted and ran. And the weirdest thing happened when I came back to internet. The blog was getting shared like all across. So the people that strangers were reading it and sharing it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is wild. And I was getting like messages from so many people saying like, thank you for writing this because this is how I felt for a really long time. And I feel so seen through this article. And then I also conversely got people who are like, no, this has nothing to do with fitness. Like, keep this out of fitness. So I got both things, but it was the first thing that like actually people were reading outside of just like my friends and family. And it was scary, but also I was like, oh, I did this and I survived. Like, I'm okay. Um, and again, this is really, this is pre 2020, so people really weren't talking about these topics within the wellness space. And so I remember the article just was getting shared far and wide. And shortly after that, I got an opportunity from Self Magazine to write an article for them. And so that was like my first freelance writing opportunity. And it was because I just had the courage to do that thing that felt really scary and to be seen. And I think that really gave me the courage to just keep doing things that felt uncomfortable, because that was, up to that point, that had been the most uncomfortable thing that I had done in like a public space. And it gave me the courage to keep doing it. And then I just got used to like the trolls. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't bother me sometimes, but I now at this point, I just block people because I can tell right away if a person is here because they're like, oh, I want to learn more, or they're here just to like try to get me to convince them that they're wrong. And I'm not here to do that. So I think now, I'm just really good at like letting it roll off my back, hitting the black button and moving on with my life. But being seen is scary, right? And I definitely think there sometimes feels like a lot of pressure that comes with it because you don't want to say the wrong thing and don't want it to be misinterpreted. And I think that we live in a space where people are really quick to be like, I gotcha, like you did this thing wrong. I think a lot of people expect perfection out of people, right? And I think the internet doesn't sometimes give a lot of space for nuance, or for the fact that we are all learning and growing and changing, that I don't have all the answers, nobody has all the answers, and that I could very well potentially be wrong about something. And that doesn't mean that I'm trying to be harmful. It means that like maybe I just didn't understand something, or I didn't have a good grasp of knowledge on something. So I do think that because of the current climate on the internet, it does feel scarier, I think, more than ever. But also I just feel like whatever will be, will be.
Yeah, yeah, you covered so many important points there. I'm curious, like at the time when that you shared that blog post and it started getting shared widely, and you noticed that more than your friends and your family were reading it. What feelings arose? Like, did you feel terror? Did you feel excitement? Did you like what was happening? Seeing the good comments and the bad ones.
I think more than anything, I felt excitement. And I think it's because for a very long time, I felt like before that, I felt like I had to be this particular person online, right? I just to stick to fitness conversations. And then like offline though, I'm having conversations about Black feminism. I'm having conversations about anti-racism. I'm having conversations about inclusion. So like I felt like I was living two separate lives almost. Like there was this public facing persona, and then there was a person that I actually was, and I felt like it wasn't safe for me to mix those two online, especially at that time. And so I think once I did that, I felt like I was actually showing up as my true self. And I'm like, oh, this actually feels good because I don't feel like I have to put on a persona for the internet. I feel like I can really show up and have the difficult conversations, say the things that might be hard and uncomfortable. And that feels true to the work I actually want to be doing. So I think more than anything, I felt a feeling of excitement. And I think it almost was like a permission slip to myself.
Which is an indicative that you're sharing a message that is important to you. And I love that you built, also gives you that muscle memory to remember to do it, that you can survive this and you can keep doing it.
Yes.
Segueing slightly, but this is just stuff that came to mind as you were talking, is I started off my career as a freelance journalist, so doing the things like pitching magazines, and something that was like an easy win if you're not like a super experienced journalist with lots of bylines were personal essays. And so as a journalist trying to like collect bylines, you're just like, okay, what stories can I mine from my life? Like,
Yes.
and I'm lucky in that I don't regret any personal essays that I wrote, but there were some that were rejected that I look back and I'm like, thank goodness, like I should not have been writing about that yet. And I saw amongst my peers that there was some regret from some personal essays that were shared where like I remember someone wrote about being like 22 and never having a first kiss. And I can't remember what magazine, I think it was like a branch of Washington Post. And she just got a lot of trolls and like a lot of like really, really awful feedback. And she spoke about how much she wished she didn't write that essay. And that was just like not something that she wanted to share. So I'm wondering like if that's something that's ever come up in your work where you've had to like sort of deal with that line of like what is worth sharing and what is not worth sharing, like what can I take the heat for and what am I not prepared to take the heat for.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you bring up because you're right. Like personal essays are just like an easier way to get into the space. I don't have any experience in having shared something that I felt like I shouldn't share. I do think there are more personal things. I'm working on a second book, and I will say that in this book, there are definitely more personal things I'm sharing about my life. And I think, number one, that is really scary. I will say that. The second thing I will say is, to me, sharing it within the contents of a book feels safer to me than just a random essay on the internet. And I say that because, like, a random essay on the internet gets just shared. People who have no idea about you or the context of your life just read it and start commenting whatever they feel like saying. Versus a book, I feel like someone picked that up because they have some interest in the topic. They have some interest in you as a person. They have some, whatever. And they're reading it within the context of this whole body of work. And so for me, that feels like a safer place to share these really deeply personal things than singular essays. Because some of the things I'm going to talk about, I would never put in a singular essay on the internet, like for the whole world to consume. Maybe on a Substack, but not like out there. Because you need the context, you need the understanding, you need all of that for people to understand like what you're really saying. So yeah, there are definitely things that I would not just write a personal essay on, like, L.com or whatever. Like, yeah, absolutely not.
Okay, I love that. And I think I understand, on the book, it's long form, it's safe. There is more context. I think the minute we do anything like a very short form, you often can lose that nuance and that context.
Yeah.
Segueing the conversation a little bit, I heard you talking on another podcast, and I think it was released last year, that you recently got divorced because you don't want children. Was that correct?
Yeah, it's been like 5 years now.
Okay.
Kind of recent, but recent-ish, yes.
I'm curious about this because I think that, and you dived into this conversation, but I'm curious to hear a little bit about it here. Society tells us things that will make us happy. Marriage, children, following a certain path.
Yeah.
And when we don't follow that path, I wouldn't say just rejected. I think some parts of society do reject us. They look at us as they would look at you as less than if you are not fitting the prototype. But I think there's also a lot of we're concerned about, I guess, the potential rejection that might come that would make us decide to follow the path dictated by society. So yeah, I'm just a little bit curious about your story and how you decided to do what you wanted to do and not what, I guess, society says will make you happy.
Yeah, I'm talking about a lot of this in the book I'm working on now. But I will just say, I guess this is a very long story, but I'm going to make it a shorter version. I think that I grew up with the idea that, which is a lot of us do, right? That marriage and children aren't so much a choice, but that's just like what you do in life. And so I never really spent any time when I was, in my adolescence and my early 20s, I never spent time thinking about like, oh, do I want to get married? Do I want to be a mom? Like, it never even felt like something that I would consider. It just felt like that's what you do. I got married when I was 22 to a wonderful human being. We're still really good friends. I always tell people I have the most amicable divorce in history, which I'm really fortunate and blessed. But I just never spent any time thinking about if this is something that I wanted. Did I want children? And as I inched towards 30, the conversation of children wasn't really coming up in our relationship. We just, it was always like a thing that was going to happen though, right? Because we had talked about that, you know, it's just going to happen. But then as I got closer to 30, I was like, I actually don't know if I want to be a mother. You know, my sister, whom I'm very close with, she had a son when she was pretty young, and I was very active in helping her with him. I always say this, like, that's like my son. He's not, obviously, but I was really, really active in helping her, raise him. And I just saw firsthand, like, how much responsibility having a child is. And I was like, whoa, this is like 24/7. It's a lot of responsibility. And I also was like really comfortable in my life in the sense that, like, I liked having my freedom. I liked, you know, spending my weekends doing nothing if I wanted to. Like, I liked being able to go whenever I wanted to go and do whatever I wanted to do. I loved traveling. And I was just like, one day I was like, I actually don't think that I want to be a mom. And so I really started to think about it. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, yeah, I don't want this for myself. And so that became a conversation that my ex and I had. And like, he definitely wanted children, and also like seeing him interact with children, like, yes, you should be someone's father, right? Like, and it's never that I thought I wouldn't be a good mom, because I know that I could have been a good mom, but that's not what I actually wanted to do. And so it is hard, because I think, you know, it's hard because you also, like, people around you want something for you or have an idea of what your life is supposed to look like. And so it's like, it's disappointing for lots of people around you, right? And I think very much society has this way of telling women that, like, if you aren't married and if you don't have kids, you're just going to be a childless cat lady, and you're going to be lonely. You're not going to have any friends. You're going to die alone. Like, all of these things to, like, I really think scare women into making choices for themselves that, or even considering, right, making choices for themselves. And I've been reading a lot. I read this really good book recently called Spinster, Creating a Life of One's Own by Kate Bollock. And it really made me think about myself, right? Like, when I think about the version of a life that I want or what I want for myself, I'm like, I'm a person that deeply loves my quiet time. I deeply love my solitude. I deeply love lots of time and space to dream and to think. And I know that I would not be my happiest version of myself if I was someone's mother. I could do it, but I would not be the happiest version of myself. And so oftentimes, like, the gut reaction to people is like, oh, you're so selfish. Like, I've met men who told me that you're so selfish, you don't have kids. And I'm like, or maybe I'm making the most selfless decision, because I know that I would not be the best version of myself. And if I brought a child into this world, I would want to be the best version of myself for a child, right? And so I think there's all this messaging to try to convince women that we should stick to the very social conditioning that we are taught from very early on. I think about this even as early as, like, children. Boys are out playing, girls have baby dolls that they are, like, taking care of at a very early age. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with playing with baby dolls, but I'm saying it's like this very early conditioning that your life work is to be a mother and to take care of people. And I very much enjoy being the center of my universe, and I don't feel any guilt or shame about that.
This is such an interesting topic. I wish we had like another hour to talk about it. But, you know, I think similarly to a lot of stuff you're saying, you know, I think that there's trade-offs to everything. And so when I look at having children, there's massive trade-offs in your career and your life and your freedom and everything. And as someone who I don't sit on the part where I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't like kids. I have absolute certainty that I never want them. I think of like, okay, if I don't have kids, there's massive trade-offs that come with not having kids. And so I don't know if I'm curious if you relate similarly, but I hold a lot of ambiguity where I don't know what is the better path. So like I right now don't think that kids is the better path, but there is this worry of like, okay, but what if I regret that? Like, what if that's not what was best for me? And I actually, especially when there's all this messaging, like go to the gynecologist and she's like, why aren't you having kids? Like, you do it before the time runs out. Yeah. So yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are, whether you have certainty with your decision or if there's also that like, worry of like, what is the better decision when neither of them are awful, I guess. You don't have absolute. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing to know, that there's trade-offs for every decision that you make, and there is no right or wrong. I think that when I was in my mid-30s, I was seriously considering freezing my eggs, because I think there was this thought of like, well, what if I change my mind? And I think that's really one of the great things, is that we have so much more access to fertility options. So you don't have to feel like, oh my gosh, I have to have a child today or it's going to be too late. There's so many options now. And so I think that's a really positive part of it. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, and I'm actually just wasting my money freezing my eggs and then having to preserve them, because I know I don't want to have children. Like, I came to a very solid decision and I think for me it was really clear, because to be 100% honest, there's never been a day, not a single day, that I woke up and said, oh, it would be really nice to have a baby. You know, like, and some people, there are people who are like, they viscerally want a baby. Like, if they can feel it in their bones, like they want it. I've never had a day where I woke up and I was like, wow, I really think I want to have a baby. It's never happened for me one time. And so I think I became really secure in my decision. And also so my nephew now that my sister had when she was young, he's 18, right? So he's like almost going to college. And then conversely, I have a brother who has two kids, two boys that are 3 and 5. And so I go and spend time with them, and I love them. All of my nephews are my heart and joy. And also when it's time to go back home, I'm like, oh, thank God I'm going back home. This was a lot. And I'm not even doing, full-time. It was just the weekend exhausted me. And so I'm like, oh, this is not something that I personally want. I'm also really grateful to have, I have close friends who have kids. I love spending time with children. I love children in limited doses when I don't have to be the full-time provider for them. And so I get my fix from friends that have kids. I spend time with them. I help them out when I need to, and then I go back home. And so for me, I was really certain in my decision, and I have no question about what if I change my mind in the future. That does not even cross my mind at this point. I did have times when I thought that way. But again, I think what I encourage people is, if you're feeling that way, there are so many options to think about what could happen. Freezing your eggs, freezing embryos. There's so many ways to give yourself more time to consider what you want. And I think also there's this real perception, especially with your doctor, you're too old, you're getting old, you need to make a decision. I have a close friend who had her first baby naturally at 41 years old. So it's I think there's also this ticking time clock, you're running out of time, that really overwhelms people. And that's also just not true. So I think that doing things to make yourself feel comfortable, and then giving yourself the space and time to really think about, what do I really want for myself? And I think I could go, again, I could talk about this for an hour, which is why I'm writing so much about this in my book, because I have so many thoughts on this. So more in the future. Yeah.
Maybe another episode. But yeah, to your point, my mom had me at almost 41 years old, and there was no assistance involved. It was a completely natural birth. And I'm very grateful for that, because I think that I've seen a lot of people who've been raised by mothers had to give up a lot, and being older, I felt like my mom lived a whole life before my existence. That meant that she could be very present as a parent, and also there wasn't as much of that trade-off that comes with bringing a child into the world of I never got to travel and I never got to explore these different paths. So yeah, Chrissy, this was just such a fantastic conversation. I will ask you if there's time for 2 more questions, otherwise we can bring it down to 1 more question. Okay, my second to last question is actually about me. So I ask this almost every guest. Right now, my obsession is growing this podcast, and I'm curious, in your line of work as a creator, how you would advise someone with a very delusional podcast growth dream to stay resilient and committed to growing something. And
Well, I'll say the first thing is delusion is your best friend. I always say, think the biggest you could possibly think, right? There is no There's no prize for thinking small or dreaming small. I think dream bigger and bigger every single day. As delusionally as you can possibly dream, that's what I encourage. That's what I do for myself. That's what I tell everybody to do. I think with the podcast, the other thing to say is just be consistent. Just keep doing it. I think that whether we're talking about podcasting, whether we're talking about writing, whether we're talking about whatever it is that you want to do, I think that social media oftentimes is good with this illusion of like overnight success. And the people that I know who are very successful in what they do, I have a dear friend who has a really huge syndicated podcast. She's doing great. She's been doing it for 6 years. You know what I'm saying? So it's like there's this idea of overnight success doesn't usually happen. There are some rare examples of that, but that's typically not the case. So I think just be consistent, keep doing it, keep showing up. You know, I think I forgot what the statistics are around podcasts, but very few last more than a year or so. So I think just keep doing it, keep putting your work out there, keep creating, keep dreaming really, really huge about the possibilities. And I think that's the advice I give to anyone in any endeavor, because the people that are here for the long run are the people who just don't stop doing the work.
I love that. And yeah, I think it's like 50% of podcasts don't make it past episode 10 or something.
Yes.
Podcast burnout is very big. So thank you so much. Final question for people who want to get in touch with you, work with you, or read your work, where should they start? And what would you recommend they get involved with?
So my book is called The Body Liberation Project, How Understanding Racism and Diet Culture Help Cultivate Joy and Build Collective Freedom. It's pretty much available wherever books are sold. My website is chrissyking.com. I'm on Instagram and TikTok. It's I am Chrissy King. And if you just want to binge on some more episodes of my podcast or podcasts that I've been on, I don't have my own podcast. The link in my bio on Instagram and TikTok have links to other podcasts that I've been on and talked on. And then, of course, my Substack is called The Liberation Collective.
I will have everything linked in the show notes. And yeah, highly recommend reading the book and binging on all the content. Thank you so much, Chrissy.
Thank you so much. It was amazing.
This was My Rejection Story, hosted by me, Alice Draper.